through 2030. And although renewable energy is the fastest growing fuel source throughout our projections, fossil fuels still dominate the energy mix, with nearly 80% of the energy consumed during the projection period coming from fossil fuels. So among the fossil fuels, liquids has the largest share, but despite that, natural gas has the highest growth rate. It becomes the second largest fuel in total world energy consumption, surpassing coal in about 2030. And this is as we see China's coal use plateau in the mid-20s through the rest of the projection period. The share of coal generation declines. Right now, it's about 40% of generation, and by the end of the projection period in 2030, it reaches about 50%. And with current policy and regulations, we see energy-related carbon dioxide emissions growing by about a third from 2012 to 2030. So this is EIA's big caveat slide, kind of like when you go to a presentation from the investment banker and you have the slide with all the tiny print. This is EIA's version of it. It's just about how uncertain it is to do energy projections for a 25-year period. They're going to be wrong. And so some of the uncertainties, particularly when you're looking at the global market, the ecosystem. GDP is a huge driver of energy demand. So whether it's higher or lower than what we're projecting has a very large impact on what energy consumption is. For example, in China, over the last decade, we've seen double-digit growth in their economy, where we're going to see that we're anticipating that slowing through the projection period, and whether it truly decelerates as much as we're anticipating will have a very large impact on the ultimate energy consumed in the world. We also have uncertainties related to the near term. In particular, we have the uncertainty of how U.S. tight oil production may react to the current low oil price environment. Although we are seeing declining rig counts and less capital in investing within tight oil production in the United States, we're not really seeing a steep decline just yet. But over the long term, even though we're expecting oil prices to rebound in the next decade, what will the impacts be? Then we, of course, have geopolitical risk, the continued unrest in the Mideast and North Africa. Right now, we have about 3 million barrels per day offline of crude production, liquids production. So what will that be in the future? We have what will happen when Iran re-enters the world oil market. And so the list basically goes on and on and on. So looking at our global outlook, this graph is basically the key to all the findings I am going to be showing you in this presentation. It's somewhat of a Kaya identity type of graph, but really between the uncertainty slides and this slide, this really kind of frames the whole discussion within the IEO. So this graph shows the major drivers of world energy demand. And this includes economic activity and population growth, which could influence increases in energy use, and pulling in the opposite direction are improvements in the energy use per unit of economic output. So this is the energy intensity. And this is a result of efficiency improvements as well as structural shifts in the economy. So for all the drivers, you can see there's differences among the key countries and regions. Of note, in terms of economic prosperity, you can see China and India is rising faster in terms of their GDP per capita, then their energy intensity falls. So that will have a very large impact on international energy markets for the next several decades. There's also significant population growth that we're projecting in the Middle East and Africa, where we have declines in Russia and Japan. You can see that the per capita economic output grows as similar relates in the mature economies of the United States and OECD Europe, and they're about 1.5, 1.7% per year, and this is only about 40% of the projected growth rate we're seeing in China and India. So just taking a look at energy use by fuel. Use of all fuels grows throughout the projection period. And as I mentioned earlier, renewables is the fastest growing fuel within our projection. One of the things that you'll notice, I'm presenting results from our reference case, which is current laws and regulations. At the time that we were modeling this, the CPP had not been finalized. So the dotted line for the US, the Clean Power Plan, includes some of the findings from a previous analysis EIA did on the Clean Power Plan's implementation. So Clean Power Plan would lower coal use and increase renewable use. Oil does, as I mentioned earlier, does remain the largest source of energy, but its share falls from about 1/3 to 30%. On a worldwide basis, this liquids growth in liquids consumption primarily comes from the transportation and industrial sectors. There are strong policy incentives for renewables, which is supporting the growth in those fuels. So in terms of end use, similar to what we've seen in the past, despite the growth in energy overall, the end use, the shares by end users are basically the same, with industrial consuming over 50% of the world's energy. One of the things that we look at is a correlation between electricity and GDP growth, which is typically highly correlated. In IO 2016 reference case projections, we expect economic activity will continue to drive electricity demand, but just not quite at the level it has in the past. So for example, from 2005 through 2012, the world's GDP increased by 3.7% per year, where the world net electricity generation rose by 3.2% per year. In many parts of the world, there's policy actions to support efficiency measures, and that has helped decouple the economic growth from the growth in electricity. So in this IEO, over the projection period, we have GDP growth being 3.3% for the world, and electricity growth at only 1.9%. So again, if you look back into recent history, we had GDP growing at 3.7 and electricity closely behind at 3.2. Going forward, we're seeing growth at 3.3% and electricity growth at 1.9. So if we had held the same relationship going forward, clearly electricity consumption would be much higher. So non-OECD nations drive the increase in total energy use. So if you go back to that first graph that I showed you, where you saw the increase of GDP per capita and the decreasing energy intensity, this is within the OECD nations. This is a kind of a logical outcome. Non-OECD accounts for 84% of the world's increase in energy consumption over the 2012 through 2040 period, when it rises by about 71%. And this is compared to OECD energy consumption, which increases only 18% over that same time period. So most of this is coming from non-OECD Asia, which accounts for over 50% of the increase in world energy use. In 2012, non-OECD Asia accounted for nearly 1/3 of the total world energy consumption. But with this strong economic growth, we're seeing a near doubling by 2040 in non-OECD Asia energy growth. And in fact, non-OECD Asia energy consumption surpasses all OECD nations by the year 2030. So again, this is just in non-OECD Asia, surpassing OECD in 2030. We see a decline in carbon intensity in both the non-OECD and OECD, and this is partly owing to the shift towards less carbon-intensive fuels, such as the growth in natural gas, as well as different countries such as China moving to more of a service economy from an industrial economy. You can see what's circled in gray in the history. There was actually an increase in carbon intensity in non-OECD from the 2000 to 2010 type of period, and this is with the advances in industrialization and urbanization in certain economies in the non-OECD. So just taking a look at liquid fuels. We have world use of petroleum and other liquids growing from 90 million barrels per day in 2012 to 121 million barrels per day in 2040. Most of the growth in liquid fuels consumption is in the industrial and transportation sectors, primarily in the transportation sectors, which accounts for 62% of the total growth. We do see some non-liquids use in the transportation sector, such as natural gas and electricity and hybrids, but liquids continues to be the dominant fuel for that. Outside the transportation sector, we do have growth in the industrial sector as well, which uses liquids as a feedstock. Non-OECD regions account for essentially all the growth that we're seeing in liquid fuels in the IEA 2016 reference case, and in particular, consumption from Asia and the Middle East accounts for about 75% of this increase in liquids fuel. And part of this is owing to the growth in transportation and passenger miles. So that what this shows you is with the growth in GDP, how does passenger miles correlate with that? And you can see that the OECD regions, for the most part, are much more economically developed by definition, and thus have higher levels of personal mobility. But even given that, you can see in China and India and other non-OECD Asia that this is growing. So transportation is and passenger miles are growing in those regions. In terms of where this is, the increased liquids consumption is going to be supplied from, we see OPEC still serving an essential role in supplying this increment of growth. It contributes more than half of the increment that's needed to satisfy the increased consumption. So for OPEC, it grows by 13 million barrels per day, and this is compared to non-OPEC sources, which grow by 10.1 million barrels per day. In terms of other liquids, these are the components of other liquids. In large part, as you can see, it's dominated by NGPLs, natural gas plant liquids, and a lot of this is because of the levels of natural gas production, and this is a co-product with that. In terms of some of these coal to liquids and gas to liquids, as well as biofuels, there is going to be an effect with the current low price environment, since these are very capital intensive type of industries, that the investment in this current low oil price environment is not being made in terms of building coal to liquid and gas to liquid facilities, which may reduce the share that they'll contribute. Looking at natural gas, similar to what we've seen, the strongest growth, and it's true for natural gas as well, the strongest growth in natural gas consumption is projected for countries in the non-OECD Asia. That said, consumption of natural gas grows in every IEA region. For non-OECD regions, it grows an average about 2.5% per year, and this is in contrast to in OECD areas where it grows about 1.1%. Non-OECD countries account for 76% of the increase in natural gas consumed. In terms of where it's going to be coming from, We see large growth in production from China, and this is primarily from their shale resources. We also have continued growth in the United States production of natural gas, as well as growth in Russia. And the Russian natural gas production growth is primarily from the Arctic areas as well as the eastern regions. China, the United States, and Russia accounts for 44% of the overall increase in natural gas production. Although the world's shale and tight resources, what was formerly known as unconventional resources, are largely untested, we do see some strong commercial levels of production in these resources coming from China and Canada within our projections. For China and Canada, their production from these tighter resources are going to contribute about 80% of their overall domestic natural gas productions. In the United States right now, shale gas provides for about 50% of total production. So moving on to electricity. This is just showing you the graph by region that I showed you earlier about the relationship to GDP and electricity. And you can see just in the non-OECD grouping that they had a rapid rise of electricity growth and GDP growth with the growth in industrialization as well as urbanization. And we expect that to decline even further than what we're seeing in the more mature economies of the OECD. So in terms of what we're seeing, the electricity being generated by fuels, we're seeing growth in natural gas as well as renewables, and this takes away some of the share that coal has had. Coal has typically, since the late 80s, produced about 37 to 40% of the world's electricity generation, and that falls to 30% by 2040. And so natural gas, coal, and renewables, and we do include hydropower as a renewable at EIA, large hydropower, roughly have the equal share by 2040. In terms of non-hydropower renewables, we're showing the largest growth coming from solar, with a growth rate of 8.3% per year. Hydropower, though, in some areas of the world still grows. This is largely in the developing nations. In terms of nuclear power, most of the growth in nuclear power is coming from China, where they put on 139, they install 139 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity. In terms of the OECD, only in Korea do we see growth in nuclear capacity, where it grows. They're adding about 15 gigawatts of capacity, but decreases in nuclear capacity in Canada as well as OECD Europe, nets an overall reduction in nuclear capacity for the OECD. So just quickly taking a look at energy-related emissions. They are increasing, and as I mentioned earlier, they're increasing by about a third from 2012 to 2040. One of the things to note is just really the shares over time have shifted between what's contributing to energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, where in 1990, the share of liquid fuels emissions made up about 43% of total emissions, and then by 2012, that was the share coal had, and we're seeing that decline particularly with the increase in emissions from natural gas due to the increased use of natural gas. Just taking a look at coal, China, the United States, and India account for over 70% of the world's coal consumption. Over our projection period, we're only seeing growth continued in India of coal. We have China's growth plateauing in the mid-2020s. And as you would expect, just with the growth in energy consumed in non-OECD Asia, it accounts for 60% of the increase in the world's energy-related CO2 emissions, particularly as they rely more heavily on fossil fuels than the rest of the world. And so that is my presentation. Thank you. Sure.
That great presentation that we want to talk about there. Let's just, I'm not sure where to start, but you showed projections for all the different fuels and what the outlook looks like. If we had put up the 450 part per million scenario, it would look pretty different, right? It would. So talk a little bit about how different it looks and what that means for the path we're on now and the role that Paris plays in the projections that you just showed and what the delta is between what you just showed and what your 450 scenario is, which is what gives us a chance of increasing.
Well, I will start by saying we actually don't have a 450 scenario to speak of. We don't have a load. We don't have a Paris model.
But maybe you just do it domestically, the AEO, and I know that people, I guess the EIA has one. Yeah. But if you figured out globally what 450 part per million looks like, yeah. Talk about what you think that looks like versus you want me to hold it? Okay, I can do that. Thanks.
Okay. I mean, I would anticipate that there'd be a decrease in coal and an increase in renewables, as you would imagine. One of the questions that we've gotten with our IEO, because of the timing of the release and the timing of our modeling, is how does it reflect the INDCs related to Paris? And how have we modeled them and how have we incorporated them? And where there was actually policies in place with these INDCs, they have been incorporated already within our projections. So for example, China is only 2% of the INDCs that were submitted had peaking, what they call peaking requirements. We're going to peak by a certain year and we're going to hold our emissions at that level. China was one of those countries that, so only 2% of the INDCs had them. Unfortunately, one of the largest countries had it. And so we took very carefully looked at, what is China's energy-related emissions levels in 2030, and how could we, what would need to be done to hold them there. What we felt was reasonable for a reference case is we do have their emissions growing through 2030, but the growth significantly is smaller after 2030, from the 2030 to 2040 time period. So there is some reflection in that scenario, or in a reference case. Additionally, some of the INDCs had land use requirements. This includes Brazil and Canada. So this is, they're going to combat carbon emissions and emissions in general with how they use land, and that's something that we don't necessarily model or have within our energy-related CO2 emissions. Interestingly, the UN did put out a report where they produced what they were assuming different emission levels would be for these different countries based upon their INDCs. And for some of the countries, such as Brazil and Canada, we actually came very close to in terms of how we're reflecting the emissions within the IEO. So I'm sure that might not be a very satisfying answer since we don't have a specific internationally. Internationally, we do have some side case scenarios. We have a high and low oil price scenario for the IEO, and we also have a high and low macro. But we don't have the full, in our domestic outlook, we have a full suite of extended policy cases and just different things.
But just to understand, so when you model particular countries, say the United States, you're going to model the Clean Power Plan, the fuel economy standards. You're not modeling 26 to 28% reduction, the INDC commitment. You're modeling policies that you can identify.
That is correct. We model policies, specific policies. And that's another challenge with where some of these INDCs are right now. I believe they said 96% of the countries that contribute 99% of the emissions have submitted these INDCs, but many of those countries have yet to place
a gap between
the policies, how they're going to get there. There's also some very gray areas. For example, if you look at Mexico's INDC reflects a change from baseline for a business as usual, but they don't really spell out, well, what is that business as usual case? And so when they're reducing from a certain level in the next decade, well, what are they anticipating that level to be? And
let's just sort of talk about each of the different fuels for a couple of minutes. So you show, there's a lot of coal has obviously faced a lot of headwinds in the U.S. The coal industry is not doing well. Speculation that maybe we've seen peak coal demand. Chinese coal demand declined, I think, slightly last year. You show it, I think, growing a little bit more, but basically plateauing.
Yeah.
So what's the outlook for coal? Coal is sort of, often you hear rhetoric that coal is on its way out, coal is a dying fuel, but when you look around the world, it is a big shift to stop growing at those rates, but is it accurate to say you still think where we're headed now, coal is playing a really big role for a really long time, absent those kind of additional policy measures that you just talked about?
Yes, coal within our outlook is still I believe the third largest contributor to energy consumption. We have coal growing by, I believe it's like 0.6% per year throughout the outlook. We do see really the main growth area, or what's driving a lot of the growth, is use in India, where they are using it both for their industry, their steel industry, and they import in all their coking coal. They don't produce it, as well as for their electric sector. There has been some constraints infrastructure-wise within India, even to get, I know they've had some problems, I believe, last year, even just moving the coal to where it needs to be because of issues with the rail lines. So there are things keeping back their full potential of coal use, but we do see it growing in
And
India.
can you talk, that sharp increase in coal and then basically plateauing, the biggest drivers of that change, was it policy? You were driven by climate or air quality? Was it the structural changes in the Chinese economy? Something else?
I think for China in particular, it's a combination, but definitely policy has played a role within that, and with their INDC committing themselves to a 20, I think it's like mid-20s level of coal consumption through the future. That definitely is a driver, but that combined with the fact there is a structural shift in their economy as they're moving towards more of a service-oriented economy, that's also supporting that plateau, but policy is definitely one of the key drivers with that.
And Prime Minister Modi was here. There were really promising discussions with the U.S. administration about INDCs, about the growth of renewables, very aggressive renewable targets in India. But in terms of total Indian energy consumption and CO2, you showed coal increasing at pretty rapid rates. Much smaller total numbers than China, but pretty strong growth rates. Is that right?
Yes, that is true. Although I do believe, and I don't have my IEO tables with me, but I do believe we have growth as well in renewables within India as well. I think India within our projections for GDP has a 5.5% per year increase in GDP. It's has the strongest growth out of all the countries and regions within our projections. So in order to support that growth and support the energy consumption, growth in energy consumption that comes with that, they are expanding coal, but they are also targeting gas and renewables and other less carbon-intensive fuels.
And can you say a little more about that link between economic growth and energy demand? I mean, there's been talk of decoupling. These could be not, I mean, we've seen them in some sense decouple for decades now, right? The energy intensity of the economy has gone down. We use less energy per unit of GDP. But is that going to increase in the future even further?
The decoupling?
Yeah, the connection between the impact that that GDP growth has on energy demand.
I think we're definitely seeing, the strength in the decoupling, and you can even in some of the graphs that I showed where you saw GDP in electricity, not total energy, you could see that decoupling strengthening, particularly as some of the more industrialized countries, such as China, move towards this service-oriented type of economy. But then, you have, in India, more of an industrialization occurring there as well. So it's kind of just shifting.
I mean, I just want to be clear. I always have like a little pet peeve with this word decoupling. I mean, they're still strongly connected.
They are still very strongly connected.
It's just that the energy intensity of GDP growth in the future will continue to be less than it's been in the past.
And some of that is also just a large drive for energy efficiency as well.
Right. And one of the things I assume that would drive coal demand too would also be the cost of substitute. So how the natural gas world is changing. We're going to see over the next 5 years, people are talking about a glut of gas, the US and Australia putting huge amounts of LNG into the global market. $18, $20 natural gas prices in Asia that are now down below $5. That affects the cost of gas as a substitute fuel. What's the outlook in your view for the global gas market, global gas prices, and the effect that has on demand for other fuels like coal and renewables?
So through 2019, EIA is anticipating about a 30% increase in the world's LNG capacity, and this is primarily from projects coming on from the United States and Australia, and that is feeding into the glut that you're referring to, and plus then we have the slowing of the growth in economies in Asia that's weakening demand, and we have Japanese some nuclear capacity returning in Japan, which is also reducing the demand for natural gas for that country. We do see the markets rebalancing in the mid-2020s. In terms of prices, we don't anticipate at this point within the production period like a global gas price. So right now we still have very distinct regional markets for gas. So even though the prices are closer together, like as you refer to that price in Asia, which was typically $18 and was very much an economic incentive for a lot of LNG projects in this country being low, but that's just largely because the oil prices, clearly because the oil prices are very low, combined with this additional liquefaction capacity coming online. But we do see through the mid-2020s, growth in consumption. We see increasing use of floating gas and storage units for countries that have swing demand or don't want to invest in a complete regasification unit. We see the growth in that technology, and again we see growth in natural gas being consumed for electricity around the world. So we do feel that there is going to be enough demand to support the capacity.
And with this increased liquidity in the global gas market and increased gas trade, and you studied the gas market for a long time, do you see the price of gas in Asia being still set by the price of oil for a long time, or based on supply and demand for gas as a commodity?
It will increasingly be delinked from oil. So the way that EIA considers it, or how we consider it in our models as well, particularly when we're deciding, what type of capacity we should be building domestically, like within the annual energy outlook. We feel that there's a certain degree of linkage between oil prices and in Asian markets as well as somewhat in European markets, but as more and more of what we consider flexible volumes of LNG come online, so these are flexible volumes largely are coming from the United States because of the gas price linkage with that the oil price, the linkage starts to decrease. But we never have a complete collapse like within our model of the oil price linkage within in Asia.
The head of the IEA, Fatih Birol, a couple of days ago, I think, made some comment about how, 5 years ago they did this study, The Golden Age of Gas, with a question mark, Golden Age of Gas. And then he, I think, was quoted as saying the Golden Age of Gas had stalled. That, what was seen as potentially a bridge fuel, a transition fuel, that support for climate policies and other things could boost demand for gas, we weren't seeing. So is the Golden Age of Gas, has it stalled? Is it over, or what's the outlook for gas? And what are the key drivers of that? Technology, policy choices like we've seen in Europe or elsewhere?
Yeah, I don't, whether it's the golden age of gas or if it's the we should be writing the obituary for the golden age of gas. I mean, we see gas consumption growing through both domestically, within our annual energy outlook, as well as internationally. And we see that because it is, for many economies, a cleaner option of fuel. So it's policy driven. And then we also have, particularly in the United States, with our how productive our resources and how much gas we can get out of the ground for at what price we can get it out of the ground at. So like one thing I will say is our IO 2016, the foundational domestic for the U.S. Projections within that came from the Annual Energy Outlook 2015, right? Because we model on a lag, and that was what was available and published. So recently, we produced our Annual Energy Outlook 2016. We released a reference case, which includes a clean power plan and a no clean power plan case. And we're going to be rolling out different cases all this month. I think we're releasing more clean power plan cases, since there's several ways to adopt that this week. And then we have extended policies. We have the phase 2 on vehicles. There's a lot of different cases. But one of the most striking things, I think, about the Annual Energy Outlook this year is if you look at natural gas and the production of natural gas, Henry Hub prices over the projection period don't rise over $4.50, which is a huge change from what we've had before. And since we're a number one producer of gas in the world, I mean, that does have a cascading effect. So in terms of the golden age of gas, I mean, EIA being policy neutral, we usually don't like to deem anything as a golden age or anything, but we're certainly, seeing continued growth in gas and with continued low prices.
Does the world want U.S. gas anymore?
I think so. I mean, there is.
You said the price from 18 down to 5 or below. So, is that, given how the market has changed?
Yeah.
Is there still a market for U.S. exports?
I think we're seeing a market for U.S. exports, and in fact, within our annual energy outlook, the recently released annual energy outlook, we're seeing significantly higher levels of LNG exports compared to our previous AEOs. Through like the mid 20s to late 20s, there's a definite
because of a lower projected price for domestic supply, a higher price for global spot markets.
It's driven by the lower domestic supply price, but even with the lower, but it's still economic to export even with the lower international prices.
Okay. You also showed pretty sustained, strong growth in oil demand for a long time. 300,000 pre-orders for the Tesla. There's a lot of excitement about the extent to which electric vehicles could reach a tipping point. What's your view of alternatives to oil? How uncertain is that outlook for oil demand that you have in there? And then just more broadly, when you do these projections, how do you... I mean, EIA gets criticized sometimes, right? We know the projection is going to be wrong, but that's fine. They're all wrong. But the question is, they get criticized for sort of, how do you think about the potential for technology and innovation in the sort that we can't really always see today. How do you think about that when you see these things taking off, like the potential for electric vehicles to sharply grow?
So one of the new things that we have in this IEO 2016, so EIA is making a real push of expanding our international modeling capabilities, and that's actually one of the reasons why we didn't we were late in producing this IEO, and because we were hoping to get it out by December. Is one of the driving factors is we have a new international transportation model, which is much more detailed than what we've had in the past. But and as you said, all models are no model's perfect, and all projections are going to be wrong. But we're seeing liquids continue to dominate in heavy duty trucking, in light duty vehicles. We do see some alternatives. Tesla, or it's my understanding that for electric vehicles we aren't seeing them gaining a huge market share. We do have, for some uses, alternative energy, such as like natural gas. And by 2040, within our projections, 50% of bus fleets are fueled by natural gas. So we do see some alternatives to liquids, but liquids still are the primary fuel of choice for transportation within our projections, within our models. In terms of how we view, technology. Usually we don't, in our reference cases, we don't necessarily have we don't anticipate disruptive technology. So something really big is going to happen in 2026, but just wait for it, and it's going to change everything. Like we don't really look at that, but we do consider, we evaluate current technology and the growth of current technology. So like the Tesla question, is that, okay, they have all these orders, what are the likelihood, what are the economics for actually getting large-scale adoption around the world of an electric vehicle. So it is something that we do consider, but within that consideration, we still found liquids to be the ideal the optimal transportation fuel within our model.
One of those disruptive technologies was shale, right?
Yes.
And that was not just in the EIA, but lots of people didn't see the full potential coming. I'm just curious, the International Energy Outlook outside the U.S., what do you think the outlook is for shale outside North America, and is it going to lead to the same sort of supply revolution we've seen here in the U.S.?
We see, so EIA has, along with ARI, which is a contractor, has shale assessments and assessments of different shale basins around the world. So there definitely is resources around the world, clearly. In terms of the commercial, us seeing what is going to be commercially produced, we're considering Argentina has an attractive looking shale, and we do see some levels of production occurring there. But really, I would say the major non-U.S. or non-North America shale type production is coming from China within our projection. So right now in China, there's a formation called the Long Maxi in the Sichuan province, and they have been drilling wells there and getting some production from those wells. And we're seeing within our projections that that it is a productive resource. Whether people can match the success we've had in the United States, there's a lot of issues and a lot of factors beyond the resource. Clearly the resource is a huge factor, and with these shale resources, even though they're all classified, say, as shale, they can be very distinctly different. But there's also above the ground factors. There's the community support. There's royalties, which is a huge, and mineral rights, which is huge in the United States for supporting this. There's just the experience and know-how that we have in the United States because of the supportive business environment. In fact, we've been doing this for decades. That supports the level of production we're seeing compared to elsewhere in the world.
And so I understand, the role EIA plays, modeling current policy, not ambition like 2 degrees, modeling, not and not modeling as a reference case disruptive sort of technologies. But I'm just wondering, in your own mind, if this turns out to be wrong 20 years from now, what do you think are the most likely reasons it's wrong? Like, what seems to you like the biggest uncertainties, where there might be disruptive tipping points? What seem like the most likely areas for that?
Well, I think, I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think a lot of that, I mean, and this isn't necessarily technology, I think a lot of where it could be wrong is in the GDP, our GDP growth assumptions, because that is a huge driver in consumption. There's certainly there's how people, just different policy things, the policy related to nuclear, a lot of European countries have announced or voiced, that they're thinking of retiring some of their nuclear, and whether that type of policy happens. The adherence of climate policies, that's a huge uncertainty. But the thinking, like, going out 20 years, where do I think, I think we might have got this wrong. Like, I really don't have, it's really like in my mind, there's just a lot, there's so much uncertainty. It's fraught with uncertainty that I really couldn't target one thing in particular. The oil prices, I mean, who would have guessed, 5 years ago what oil price environment we'd be in right now? I mean, it's incredible. And
where are we headed on the oil price?
So within the IEO projections, oil prices do rebound. They get up to $80 within the next decade, and then they increase throughout the projection period to $140. I believe, and again, this is based on AEO 2015 oil prices because of the cycle. In AEO 2016, our oil price path is lower.
Are we setting ourselves up for another underinvestment cycle? I think the Financial Times today had the Wood Mac study, $1 trillion in capital in the oil sector cut back, oil and gas sector cut back between now and 2020. So is the market are we really tight in a couple of years when you look out? You have decent demand growth in your numbers.
I mean, the potential is definitely there. I mean, we're not necessarily seeing that within our modeling, but I mean, it certainly seems that within the energy industry, there are these cycles that happen. I mean, even with gas, like looking at gas and investments in gas infrastructure, and then the lack of use within that infrastructure. So I mean, it's certainly possible.
And I think I read, we have Antoine Half here, our senior fellow who used to write the monthly oil market report at the IEA. So you can tell me if I have this right, that his successor now at the IEA, the idea of a call on OPEC may be sort of going away, that you sort of look at supply and demand in non-OPEC countries, you figure out the difference, and you assume OPEC will meet that, not that OPEC supply is determined always by fundamentals. So I'm just wondering how you see the potential changing role of OPEC, given what we've seen in their behavior over the last 2 years, and does that affect the way, when you do the short-term energy outlook or these long-term outlooks, the way you're modeling and forecasting OPEC supply or thinking about the impact on price?
I mean, we definitely, the modelers the liquids modelers definitely try to rationalize and consider what OPEC and what role OPEC will have in the future. For instance, one of the things that it seems that we're considering is the role that the OPEC countries want to maintain their share, whether that's a motivator, whether the short term, in terms of why haven't supply has been cut back, or why, so that's something that we consider. Unfortunately, I probably don't have a really great answer for that. But.
And you showed the numbers, but just tell us again where you see the biggest growth in renewables, both within the renewable sector, the type of energy, and then also regionally, where the biggest growth is going to come from, and what the drivers are. Again, are these rapidly declining costs? Is it policy drivers?
So we see a lot of growth in solar, and I believe that in terms of, I had a bonus slide in here where the growth was coming from. It was geographically in China is where we're seeing most of the growth, and a lot of that is policy driven. because as they're replacing their coal generation with a more carbon neutral type of generation, including the renewables.
And the growth in nuclear is mostly in China too?
It is, yeah. They have 139 gigawatts coming online within the projection.
And when you model nuclear in the U.S., do you have to make an assumption about licensing renewables? What is that?
Renewals?
Renewals of the licensing.
We do make an assumption. I'm not sure if we definitely have retirements of capacity, but I think because I know one of the interesting things is in the next year's AO and IAO, we're considering moving the projection period out to 2050, and that will bump into some of these the licensing license renewal issues with nuclear because of the expiration dates.
Yeah, 2040 always sounds so far away, but 1990 doesn't sound like that long ago.
Yeah.
So, but I think we're in the middle. So it's not that far. Okay, so we have time for questions. Do we have a microphone? Is that how we're doing questions? Does anyone know? Is that okay? Yeah. Thanks.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Yep, thank you. If you could just introduce yourself and
sure.
keep the question brief. Thanks.
My name's Miles. I'm a student at Columbia, and I'm interning here over the summer. My question is, I've been following the situation in Venezuela and over the oil price declining. And one thing I've seemed to surmise from that situation is that it's not very easy to drop oil. So I'm wondering, what is the plan for people who, how is like you mentioned that the projected carbon intensity is going to decline over time. So how are institutional investors who are in charge of pensions and entitlements, how are those funds going to shift over the next 20 years as far as their projections go? And how are we what's the plan for taking care of the aging populations and oil dependent economies who are going to rely on the entitlements that oil previously brought? And is that about just shifting in terms of where we process natural resources and what kinds of natural resources we're processing? What would those be? And I wonder how do you map that out?
So we do consider subsidies or these entitlements, as you refer to them, within certain economies when we're doing our modeling, but we don't necessarily take into account the impact on the population. I know one of the things that we're considering or we're looking at right now, and this isn't necessarily to feed into our models or our projections, is in particular if you're considering Venezuela and the situation that they're in right now. They have a lot of relationships with neighboring countries where and how is this how are neighboring countries paying back their debt to Venezuela because they can at a discounted level because Venezuela is interested in having the income, and whether this in particular, if you look at some of the Caribbean countries which relied on Venezuelan oil for electricity generation, some of them are using the combination of even with the low oil prices, both the low gas prices, of an opportunity to shift into more of natural gas fired electricity plants. This is particularly happening in Jamaica, and there's several other Caribbean countries that have had relationships with Venezuela. So I think a lot of times what we consider isn't necessarily the social aspect. I mean, we certainly do look at at the age of the population how it comes to energy use, et cetera, but we don't look at how oil prices or something will impact the threat of society.
But these are, these are a lot of countries that there are a lot of countries that depend heavily on oil revenue, and then when we talk about a transition to lower carbon energy, the possibility that we'll see peak oil demand and it'll start to decline, that we'll move to a post-oil era. Some people speculate the Saudis are selling more now because they think it'll be worth less in the future. We see oil and gas majors diversifying in some cases, investing in renewable businesses or shifting toward gas. So, but when I look at your numbers, then I'm like, well, we don't have to do any of those things. We've been using oil for a long time. Is that the right conclusion when someone looks at the International Energy Outlook, or just sort of put the projections in the proper context when people think about the likelihood that we could see a real shift away from oil? Is the takeaway from this analysis that's pretty unlikely, or just that given what we have in place today, current policies, and not assuming sort of disruptive technologies, that's what the world looks like, but those things, you know, we really need to be thinking about those things.
Well, I definitely think we should be considering all these things. I mean, the reference case is current policies, so we do have oil growing by, I think, 1.1% per year, or liquids, and it is remaining the dominant fuel throughout our projection period. And again, tying it back to transportation in particular, since that's the largest, you know, consuming sector of liquids fuels, as you have these developing economies growing in their GDP, and there's higher levels of personal wealth, and people are buying cars, and they have things, and you know that we're seeing, you know, continued support for liquids consumption.
So just again, for those watching online or listening to the podcast, my name is Jason Bordoff. I'm here with Angelina LaRose, Office Director for the Office of Integrated and International Energy Analysis at the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and we're discussing the EIA's International Energy Outlook. Let's go to the next question here in the aisle.
Hi, Timothy Chung with Clearview Energy Partners. I think you mentioned that OPEC production is supposed to grow by, I think, 13 million barrels. Can you elaborate on where that's coming from? Is that evenly distributed, or a couple of countries in particular? And kind of on Miles' point, how does the IEO, either in this one or perhaps future iterations, factor in things like Saudi Vision 2030, and they're trying to get away from being an oil-dependent economy? Thank you.
Okay. So of the OPEC growth within the IEO, is 70% of comes from the Middle East OPEC countries, as you would expect. But we do not break out the particular countries in terms of where that growth is coming from. In terms of how we factor in, like Saudi's 2020, I mean, I'm not sure how we factored that into this IEO, but it is, we do, those are when we look at policies, different announced policies from countries, we tend to look at the track record a country might have with keeping, you know, their policy pronouncements and adhering to them, and we also just take into account what we think is reasonable for the country given certain limitations. So, for example, when I mentioned about China having, they wanted to have coal consumption peak at a certain time, and for emissions, you know, we really evaluated that, and we do have definitely an elbow in there where it slows and starts to plateau, but it's not necessarily strictly adhered to the policy pronouncement.
There was a question back here, and then we'll come up here. Yep.
Thank you. John Malone, Van Wall Capital. Can you speak to the assumptions that you're making in the forecast around deep water development? You know, in an $80 world, is that growing? Is that shrinking? What's happening?
For deep water Gulf?
Correct. Deep water in general, Brazil, Eastern Canada, anywhere. Is deep water development going to increase, decrease, or stay the same in an $80 world?
You know, I don't know the exact answer to that. In terms of, I know, particularly when you look at offshore production, since those projects are multi-year projects, you do have some projects that have started and went down a path prior to the $50 oil that we're seeing. Because even in within our annual energy outlook for like offshore for the Gulf, we are seeing growth in Gulf of Mexico production. I'm not quite sure if we're seeing that from deep water, but a lot of it is due to the lead time and the schedules of developing these projects, since they're longer term.
Antoine, do you have a view on the outlook for deep water? As long as you're in the room, you spent a lot of time.
And he is also, I know you introduced him as a former IEA, or he's also a former EIA.
That's true.
So what do you want me to, what kind of pearl of wisdom do you want me to shed
Well,
on?
you could say anything, but the question was specifically in a world of sort of 80-ish oil, what the outlook for offshore supply is around the world, whether it's Brazil or the Gulf of Mexico or elsewhere.
Yeah, well, I think, it's a combination of projects that have been invested in and sanctioned before the price started collapsing. So there's always a lag, and we see oil coming on stream, based on investments that made sense at a higher price, even if that price is no longer here. And then looking forward, you're going to have very selective investments. You're going to have some. And we had some major projects approved last year, just about 2, but not 0. So we're going to have a few more. And then I don't think the price is going to stay at 80 personally. So, brace yourself for the next round of high prices.
So, and while you're holding the microphone, I mean, since you joined the Energy Center from the IEA and the EIA before that, one of the major things you've been working on is thinking about peak oil demand, thinking seriously about what the likelihood is, what the drivers would be, what the implications would be. So I'm just curious your reaction to kind of a projection that shows an ever-increasing straight line for oil.
My reaction is it's great not to be at EIA and IEA anymore from that perspective, because when you're in those institutions, you're constrained in terms of the assumptions you can make. You have to abide by policies that are in place. That's the way the EIA works. You have some of the same constraints at the IEA. So one of the benefits we have at a place like Columbia is that we can make more liberal use of our judgment and not engage in scenario planning, but try to have educated guesses about what policies might be, actually. Policies that are not in place today, but that might be in place very soon. So based on that, I would imagine that I would be much more negative about the outlook for continued growth in oil consumption. Which does not mean that there's not going to be any need for oil investment, and that getting that investment in place is not going to be a challenge. It might actually be a bigger challenge because of growing concerns about stranded assets and anticipations that the energy transition will move away from oil and faster towards gas and renewables.
Yeah, we'll be having an important input to that with a workshop in Beijing in a couple of weeks, looking in detail at the outlook for Chinese oil demand. You have any reaction? Or?
Well, I was gonna ask Antoine a question since he's holding the mic. So I guess when you're looking out, over the next 15 years, I mean, I guess when do you see that? When would you anticipate oil consumption not growing?
So I don't have the answer yet. I have it soon. No, we're engaging in a fairly ambitious research agenda, looking at this very issue. And as Jason said, we have a roundtable in China at the end of this month, early next month, to look at this issue from the Chinese perspective. But we're also looking at it from the perspective of India, from the perspective of policy changes post-Paris, technology improvements or breakthroughs. But I don't know. We're really open-minded about what the answer might be, and I think we have to be conscious as well that oftentimes we're tempted to extrapolate from recent trends. So if we look at the case of U.S. gasoline consumption, until about a year ago, people were fairly convinced that it had peaked in 2007. And here we are, after 2 years of low prices, we're back at records or even at higher levels that we reached before people thought the price had started, the consumption had started peaking. So I think we have to keep a very open mind, and there's a fairly strong argument to be made for saying that we're very close to peaking, but at the same time we could say that we're still in a fairly weak period of economic growth. Chinese consumption in the interior provinces is still very low compared to the coastal provinces. Indian demand is at a fraction of what Chinese demand is, which is itself a third of what US demand is. So there's still, you could still build the case for very strong demand growth as well.
Thank you. There's a question up here, yeah. Thanks, Antoine.
My name is Natasha Udensil, Columbia University. Before I go to my question, I actually want to add what Antoine said, because talking to students, I have to tell that students do not see, most of the students do not see their careers in oil and gas, and they more see they in the renewables. And I think it's telling something.
And
I don't know when consumption will go down, but
I don't want to interrupt, but as somebody that used to work in the Office of Petroleum, Natural Gas, and Biofuels, we found it very hard to recruit students, because I think they are, everybody was more renewables
right,
focused.
and it's not only in the US, it's like in Europe also. My question actually is, you mentioned that LNG exports are feasible. And can you elaborate where this efficiency is coming from? I know you said that's low prices here, but let's say spot market prices in Europe also very low. So is it like a business model, toll model, or efficiency in transportation? Where the efficiency is coming from?
Well, I think it's looking over a longer period. So within our outlook, we have a more than doubling of LNG trade from 2012 to 2040. It goes from 12 TCF to, I believe, 29 TCF. And I think it's largely in terms of the United States, it is because of the tolling arrangements. It's a flexibility within, so it's not having a fixed point destination. So it is being able to be a little more agile. Also in the United States, if you look at the increase in the market in South America, so to transport, I mean, clearly it's a quicker transportation moving to gas to South America, and we do see increasing LNG imports within South America. In fact, we recently, in February, we had our first LNG exports of domestically sourced gas from the lower 48, and I believe the first cargo went to Brazil. And there's another cargo heading down to South America, I think that left this week. So there's that the expansion of that market. But we do I think a large part of it is driven by the contract structures, thinking of the U.S. in particular, since we are one of the main drivers of the growth in the market. The contracts, the tolling agreements, and the fact it's based on a very low Henry Hub price. So even I know, like, from history, Europe and Asia prices are very, very low, but I think particularly looking out to when the market gets a little tighter in the mid-20s.
I think we have time for another maybe one or two questions, but any other questions?
You reminded me of something, so if you don't mind if
sure.
I take an intermission and have a plug. EIA is having a conference in mid-July, which is always a very interesting event. But we're also, for those of you who are interested in the EIA, we also are having a job fair along with that conference. So where you can meet with people that are recruiting, not necessarily from the petroleum, natural gas, and biofuels team, although they are recruiting. And it's a good opportunity if there's anybody here interested in working for the federal government or the EIA in particular to kind of meet with folks. So.
Great. Okay. I saw two hands, one up here. Let me go first here, and then there was one back there.
Thank you. Sandeep Bedwan from Continuum Associates. Angelina, I had a question on your growth rate for solar. So you had 8% global growth rate for solar until 2040. And that sounds a little low compared to some of the things which we have observed in global markets. So for example, just to throw out some numbers, China has grown at like 200% when it comes to solar. India over 250% when the markets opened up 4 or 5 years ago. US alone is expected to grow 100% this year and has averaged between 70 to 80% over the past decade. So my question is, and even if you look at some other trade media, it seems that solar is expected to grow exponentially fast. The marginal cost of production or the marginal cost of energy has come down significantly too in most areas. So just trying to understand, why do you think, or why does the IEA think that the growth rates are going to be fairly moderate at 8%?
So that, again, that's 8% per annum over a 28-year period. So if, you know, in terms of a 100% growth rate, like if you're starting from one point to an end point, you know, it is a significant amount of growth in solar. You know, if you're comparing 2012 to 2040, what we have in the IEO, or within the IEO. I'm getting all my acronyms. IEA, IEO.
You're saying a high percentage growth rate is a lot easier to do off a small base than a large
Yeah.
base. That's what you're
That is really, like, I think that's one. So when you're, a lot of times when you're thinking of the U.S., oh, we grew 100%. You know, it's like, well, we grew 100% from a very small number. So if you're looking at an annual growth rate of 8.3, I'm not quite sure what our beginning and ending, if you just took a simple average of that. Other than that, in terms of why we're not seeing, you know, because even with that growth rate, solar is still just a share of renewables, which by 2040 is only making up 30% of electricity generation. I think there's, you know, with some of the reasons we have is just in terms of, you know, the cost of the technology compared to other technologies, and some of the other limitations with how it's being, how it clearly can't be used. There's no storage, you know, it can't be used as a base load type of thing in most areas. So.
I was looking over the weekend at a set of government and academic studies from 1979-80 about what share of electricity or total energy solar would be by the year 2000, and the estimates range from 7 to 25%. And I think now we're at 1, a little less than 1 for total energy, not electricity. So, yeah, doesn't mean what the future will look like. But
yeah.
Anyway, there was a question in the back.
Thank you. Jack Left at EPFEN. So my question is probably about a problem that we don't have to worry about for a few years. But one thing I was wondering is, if to reduce dependence on fossil fuels for transport, I guess that would involve, you know, increased fuel efficiency for cars or electric vehicles. When you guys look at, you know, scenarios in which electric vehicles grow rapidly, do you guys model in as well the pressure that would put on electricity generation, in the sense that I think a lot of times when that discussion occurs, it doesn't really incorporate the fact that we're still not providing most significant amounts of electricity via renewables?
We definitely look at it as an integrated, you know, our model's integrated, so we do take into account electricity. And I mean, I guess somewhat relatedly maybe to what you're getting at, you know, so increased demand for electricity, depending on the source of the electricity, would feed into the carbon-related energy emissions. One of the things that I believe our model doesn't do, that I know is something that Tesla and other people that are really looking at electronic vehicles are considering. We are not looking at electronic vehicles as a distributed battery source to support the grid, where I know people have talked about electric cars being a very much of a two-way, kind of like a ability to peak shave, you know, while your car is plugged into the grid and you're not driving it. You know, I do not believe that's something our model considers. We should, I think, later this summer we are, since it seems that there is some interest in transportation or transportation projections. Coming out, since, as I mentioned, we have this new international transportation model called ITED. Since we have ITED, we are releasing, or we're looking at the possibility of releasing a report of going over different transportation scenarios. So I think that might have some more of these answers that people might be interested in.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to thank all of you for being here. Thank you for joining us. Thank Angelina for being here. As I mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, lots of other platforms. 2 different podcast streams, one for the events we do like this, and then the other for Columbia Energy Exchange, which is our weekly 30-minute interview program with a senior energy leader in the world. I think either this Monday or next Monday, then one of those episodes will be with Adam Sminsky, the Director of the Energy Information Administration. Please join us also for our next event, which will be Monday, June 20th at 9 a.m. here at the Columbia Club, where we will look at the International Energy Agency's medium-term gas market report. Thanks all of you for coming. Please join me in thanking again Angelina LaRose.